Today, we're giving an update on the Illinois Solar Program with Anthony Starr, Director of the Illinois Power Agency. I'm Tim Montague. Welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. Today's May 19th, 2020, and I'm really looking forward to today's show with Anthony Starr. Before we get into the conversation with Anthony, I want to make a few announcements. As many of our listeners know, we broadcast this podcast live on the last Tuesday of the month, typically at 10 a.m. In June, we have Brian Haug, professional engineer and president of the Illinois Solar Energy Association. Brian is also the president of Continental Energy Solutions, the company I work for and the largest solar installer in Illinois. We are going to be discussing how the Illinois solar market has evolved since 2017. And so it'll be a nice follow-on to today's discussion with Anthony Starr. Then in July, we have a great partner of ours at Continental in Convergence Energy, a solar and storage developer from Wisconsin that does a lot of work across the Midwest. We will be interviewing Steve Johnson and John Kivlin, the two founders of Convergence Energy, developing solar and battery storage in the Midwest. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my guest today, Anthony Starr, Director of the Illinois Power Agency. Welcome to the show, Anthony.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show this morning. I've appreciated and really enjoyed the other sessions you've had over the past few months. They've been really helpful to me to sort of get insights into how other people within the solar market in Illinois are thinking about the issues facing us.
Well, I appreciate you paying attention to the podcast and coming on the show. And it's a very heady time for solar in Illinois. As many of our listeners know, since 2017, when FEJA took place, that's the Future Energy Jobs Act, we have begun adding 2,800 megawatts of solar and 1,000 megawatts of wind, additional wind, to the Illinois solar renewable market. And the primary mechanism for that is renewable energy credits. There are three main parts of the program: the adjustable block program, which is the DG program that includes residential, commercial, and community solar. And then there's the Illinois Solar for All program, which has specific carve-outs for low-income communities and off-takers, and that includes DG and community solar. And then there is the Competitive Procurement program, which is utility scale wind and solar. And we will talk a little bit about all three programs. And so, Anthony, why don't you just give us a high level about those programs? How are things going compared to how you foresaw them going in 2017 when this all got going?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard to remember what things were like before FEJA. I was sort of going back and looking through some statistics of how much solar was installed in the state prior to FEJA. And going way back, I pulled up an old email from someone at the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. For those of you who've been in the solar industry for a while in Illinois, probably is a distant memory that prior to 2015, if you wanted some sort of support for your project, other than some grants from the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation, the real game in town was the DCEO annual rebate program. And that program, over its roughly 20 years that gave out rebates, I think supported about 1,000 projects in the state and 13 megawatts. And that's sort of where sort of programmatic support for solar was. The Illinois Power Agency ran a few programs in 2015 through 2017, the supplemental photovoltaic program. That had about 1,000 projects in it, developed about 25 megawatts of solar. It used to be that if I was driving around and I happened to see solar on a home or business and glanced at the address, there were so few projects in that program that there's a fairly good chance that I would recognize the name of the project. And one of the things that's really nice and different today is as I wander around, well, I've been doing a lot less of that recently, obviously, there's more, I don't recognize solar projects. There's too many of them today. And I think that's a really great thing. It's something that's really transformative in the industry. And we really have seen a ramp up from, there was less than 100 megawatts of solar in the state prior to 2018. And now already with the adjustable block program to date, over 90 megawatts of projects have been completed. Hundreds of megawatts more projects are under development, and there's still capacity available in the small distributed generation program that we can get into as well. So it's really, the solar industry in the state does look very different. And then on the utility scale side, as you mentioned, we've run a number of competitive project procurements for new utility scale projects. 8 wind projects that can be over 1,400 megawatts of new utility scale wind will be coming out of that. 18 utility scale solar projects, that's about 1,600 megawatts of utility scale solar is under development. Now, obviously, there's a lot of challenges facing us today. Will all those projects get developed? We don't know for sure, but in recent weeks, Cargill announced that they were going to be off-taker of 200 megawatts from one of the solar projects. I think there are, there's positive and negative things we're seeing out there, but we certainly are seeing, utility scale projects at a scale that I think, if you go back a few years ago, are numbers that or would have been unimaginable to us.
Yes, it's a new day in Illinois, as I've said repeatedly over the last 2 years. And I got into the industry in 2016 before I even knew that FEJA was in the wings. And luckily then FEJA was passed in December of 2016 and then took force in 2017. But it took 2 years for the adjustable block program really to come to fruition and for those RECs to start to be released into the market. So it has been several years in the making. And, for our listeners, the adjustable block program accumulates to something like 666 megawatts of solar, and that includes residential, commercial, and community solar projects. And on the community solar front, which is an increasingly popular program across the United States, actually, or type of solar across the United States, there are 111 2-megawatt projects, so 222 megawatts AC of community solar that have been given REC contracts and are now in various stages of development and construction. We're getting towards the construction end now. Certainly some projects are under construction, some projects are slightly delayed, and we can talk a little bit about that. But why don't we start with the ABP as it's called. How happy are you with the program as a whole? It seems to me to be very successful.
I would agree. I think, again, the scale of things really indicates the success of the program. And there are certain challenges with community solar that I think we should talk about separately. I think in retrospect, having community solar as part of the adjustable block program had some disadvantages that maybe were not appreciated when FEJA was enacted. I think part of that was just that community solar nationally was such a new concept that how to fit it into a state's solar policy is an ongoing discussion. But on the distributed generation side, I'm very happy with how the program is going. We've recently reached the block capacity for large distributed generation projects. Those are the ones over 10 kilowatts in size. But to date, over 1,000 projects, large distributed generation projects have been completed. We have over 5,000 small distributed generation projects that have been completed. And the goal and our understanding of the adjustable block program and the way the drafters of it intended was to have something that was sort of an open enrollment program. And that's worked fairly well. Our previous programs, always had either competitive procurement or going back again to the DCEO rebate program. That was something where there was a small window that opened up each year and everyone rushed to get their applications in as quickly as possible. So any given homeowner who was thinking about installing solar, you didn't necessarily know if you were going to get a DCEO rebate because the funds were limited. The supplemental photovoltaic procurement was similar in the sense that installers had or aggregators had to bid there. You didn't necessarily know if your bid were going to get accepted. It was a competitive procurement, so there was less certainty about price. So the concept of the adjustable block program to create more certainty for installers about what REC prices would be like so that they could think about what was the overall value proposition to customers, I think has worked quite well. There is a lot of more certainty. The first blocks of the small DG program took roughly a year to fill, which was about what we expected. I think we were on pace to fill things up by the end of this year. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm sure we'll be talking about that later. So that part of the adjustable block program has worked very well. We've processed thousands of applications. There were some backlogs at times. I think our program administrators worked hard to reduce those, find some efficiencies. With the recently approved revisions to our long-term plan, which is the document that guides the IPA's work. There's some tweaks to the program that we're making that I hope will sort of increase some efficiencies and clarity. We're clarifying the contract, simplifying some of the application processes and requirements. So, all new programs have their growing pains. Things can sometimes take a little longer than you want, but overall, I think it really has been significant in allowing the solar industry in Illinois to grow to date.
And just for anybody who doesn't quite understand the difference between competitive procurement and the adjustable block program, the adjustable block program puts a value on RECs in a stepwise fashion from small to large. So larger projects like community solar have lower value RECs in the 30s, and then smaller projects like residential have higher value RECs in the low 70s for the early blocks. And then as the blocks fill, the value of the RECs decline, previously 4% per block. Is that still the same going from block 4 to block 5, that it'll be a 4% declination?
I think that's to be determined. I think some of that will depend upon when we are able to open additional blocks. The commission, in approving our plan, did ask us to take a fresh look at community solar prices in particular. So there could be revisions to those prices. The other thing is, as some of your listeners may know, Ameren has opened a proceeding at the Illinois Commerce Commission to revise what's known as the distributed generation rebate, or more commonly known as the smart inverter rebate, that changes the value proposition for customers in Ameren. Once that's phased in, that could affect REC prices as well. So I think there's a number of factors to be determined there. But in general, I like markets. I believe in competitive procurement are an efficient way to determine prices. So at a theoretical level, the competitive procurement model is one I really like, but I absolutely appreciate why in the distributed generation sector, because of the way sales cycles work, certainty of REC pricing that we get through the adjustable block program, where we calculated the REC prices based upon a variety of data, based upon stakeholder input on the model and approach we use, is something that creates clarity and simplicity for customers, and that value proposition is there. Now, looking at the REC prices is something that has to be done periodically to see where they are. It certainly seems in the small distributed generation program, given the pace of things, that the REC prices are probably fairly in line with what's needed to have a good value for the customers.
Yeah, and I didn't finish explaining that the competitive procurement is a reverse auction.
Actually, it's not a reverse auction. It's a competitive. It's basically an RFP process with a bid date where the bidders, if you're developing a utility scale wind or solar project, put in a fixed price for RECs, and then we take the lowest price bids and quantities up to filling the target for the procurement.
Okay, so it's very analogous to a reverse auction, though, right? The lowest bidder, the lowest viable bidder wins the bid, right?
Right, we take the lowest prices. A reverse auction is a slightly different auction mechanism where you actually start with a bid price and you see how many people bid at that price, and you lower the price and watch people drop out until you get to the quantity that you desire. It was used for energy procurement in Illinois back in 2006, and I think it'd be fair to say the reputation of reverse auctions in Illinois as a price-setting mechanism took a hit as a result.
And then there's the phenomenon of community solar, where the RECs were, I guess, so sweet that many developers rushed into Illinois. We had dozens of developers signing land leases, lease options, and then doing the preliminary permitting on these 10 to 20 acre solar farms. There are over 800 of those that went through some form of initial development, and then the program had RECs for 111, which got allocated. So then there's this large group of projects that are still sitting in the wings quote unquote shovel ready, although it's truly TBD how viable some of those are for various and sundry reasons like interconnection. But so that program was oversubscribed grossly. Any thoughts about the future of community solar in Illinois?
I think there certainly are probably the need to step back and think about what community solar should be in Illinois. What are we trying to achieve? How do we fit it into our overall clean energy goals? I think a couple of factors I think that led to the real rush for community solar here. One was that if you're looking nationally, the year when we were opening up this program, there was not a lot of new activity or new programs opening up elsewhere in the country. So Illinois was, I think, viewed by national developers as a great place to come into. We also are a large, flat state, so the ability to find 15 to 20 acres you need for a 2 megawatt community solar project really was not that difficult. The challenge, of course, was some of the surprises developers found when they went into the interconnection process and some of the complexities there, some of the issues around costs coming in a lot higher than expected. And so I think there's a lot to be worked out there. There's open proceeding before the Illinois Commerce Commission on interconnection rules. Hopefully that will yield fruit on this issue as well. So I think those are some of the factors that came in here. And also I think we had the challenge that the way the adjustable block program was structured in FEJA, it was designed to be this open enrollment type of program. As people had projects ready, they could come in and apply to the program. And that makes sense for residential or commercial solar projects, on-site solar projects. I think in retrospect, it doesn't fit in as well to the community solar model where you don't really have customers. I mean, eventually when projects are built, they'll have subscribers, but these are developer-driven projects rather than subscriber-driven programs or even host-driven programs. I don't think there were many people out there who sort of were saying, I have 20 acres of land, I really want to put a community solar project on it. It was a developer showing up one day at their door or sending them something in the mail or whatever, saying, your site appears like it could be a good site for a community solar project. Will you lease us the land for it? So again, I think the whole cycle of this is something that was very different and I think lends itself more towards having a sort of cycle of particular process for how you consider the community solar projects that should move forward. And that's ultimately what we did with the adjustable block program, where we had an initial application window and ultimately a lottery to select projects. Now, one thing I really want to emphasize about the lottery is that was the way we opened the program. In the revised plan that was approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission in February, and we published the final version of it in April, there is a new process there for selecting community solar projects. If the funding issues that are at hand can be worked out and we are able to open additional blocks of capacity for the adjustable block program, the selection of community solar projects will be partially taking projects off the wait list and partially through some new processes still to be fleshed out that will take into account additional criteria such as proximity to subscribers and location of the project. So there's still a lot more to be developed there, but again, it will look a little bit more like there'll be more deliberative process there, and that's part of the learning of the program. One thing to note on the wait list is yesterday was actually the deadline for approved vendors in the program to submit to the program administrator documentation verifying that they maintained site control and some other criteria around those projects. So we haven't finished reviewing all that data, but I would expect that some portion of the projects that are on the wait list will drop off if they're the more marginal projects where the developers really realize that these aren't ones worth maintaining on the wait list, especially ones that maybe are very far down on the wait list or had very high interconnection costs.
So the community solar program was a lottery initially, but it will not be a lottery moving forward. You're confident of that?
I wouldn't say I'm confident of it because I think ultimately for it to open up again will require some legislative changes on funding. So the extent to which legislation may also instruct us to do something different in the structure of it is something that I can't predict today. But certainly the lottery, the challenge with the lottery is, I'm forgetting the quotation attributed to Churchill about democracy being the worst form of government save all others. That's kind of, I think we've kind of adopted that as a way of thinking about the lottery. the thing that worked about the lottery was that it was, at the end of the day, objective. But it was, I think a lot of people were not happy about it. A lot of people wanted us to do something different. But I've been struck over the last couple of years, several conferences I've gone to, panel discussions about this, when developers are pressed by what would have been a fairer, better way to do it, how no one really has come up with a great other alternative. I think given the cycle of things, given the rush we saw of project applications, the lottery was the fairest way to do things. Going forward, as we learn more about community solar, as we think more about what we want community solar to be, we may approach that differently. Thinking back to when FEJA was under consideration, if you go back and look at the fact sheets that were circulated by advocates around things like community solar, they really painted a picture of community solar as being the community center putting up some extra panels so that people in the community could subscribe to that. I think there was a very community-driven vision of community solar that I think was painted back then. The reality is, for legitimate reasons from the developer point of view, they sought out places where land costs would be low and the expected interconnection costs would be low. And so that really pushed a lot of these projects into more exurban or even rural areas, often very far away from the potential future subscribers. So this is what I mean by, at some point, these are all legitimate models of community solar, but I think probably one of the key things as next steps will be to sort of think, what do we want to achieve in community solar? What should it be? What do we want projects to look like? Where do we want them located? How do we want them to serve subscribers? Then there's a good debate to be had on all of those issues.
Indeed. And I think that in general, there have been plenty of opportunities for constituents to engage with the decision makers at the IPA and the ICC to give their feedback on how they would like to see the program evolve. It's difficult sometimes to keep up with all those requests for input, but so let's talk a little bit about smaller scale DG, residential, the larger scale projects. So I think 25 kW and up, right? Those blocks 1 through 4 closed.
10 kW and up.
Okay, 10 kW and up has closed. Blocks 1 through 4. We're waiting for block 5 to open. We can talk a little bit about that. What do you see on the small scale side? How much runway is there for small scale solar for those installers that are busy signing up residents for, behind the meter residential solar?
Sure. Before getting to that, I just want to say a quick thing about the large DG blocks. Yes, those are filled. However, and we are taking wait lists of applications. We also are now beginning to see, as we're getting to the 1-year deadline from some of the initial waves of projects that applied, projects that for whatever reason did not get developed. So we are seeing projects that are, while in some cases developers are asking for extensions, others will be dropping out. So we have been able to take some projects off the wait list. I expect we'll continue to do that. Will that continue to allow new projects to go forward? Probably not. There's only a limited universe of that. Most of the projects that applied early on in the program that now come up to the energization date did get developed, but there's still a little wiggle room left in the large DG categories, is the point I want to make, although it's limited. On the small distributed generation, the under 10 kW side of the adjustable block program, there's still 66 megawatts of capacity left in the program across the state. So that will accommodate many thousand small distributed generation projects.
Great. And a parallel universe really is subscribers to community solar. So if a resident can't afford solar or doesn't have a sunny roof or doesn't own a house, they can participate in a community solar program. The solar developers are launching those subscription programs. Do you see any concerns with those programs so far?
It's too early to tell. We've seen some marketing of those, but not a lot. One thing that the IPA did as part of our response to COVID-19 was issue some updated marketing guidelines and putting, that includes a halt on in-person door-to-door sales, things like tabling, et cetera. So the extent to which community solar vendors were planning to use those sales channels to market community solar. That's on hold right now. On the other hand, a lot of project development is on hold. I think we've seen almost 40% of the community solar projects request extensions in their energization deadline. So I think there's a challenge for community solar developers. You need to get your subscribers lined up, but you don't want to get them lined up too far in advance of when your project actually will come online. So I think there's a balancing act going on right now between those two factors.
Yeah,
we're
just
in the process of
remember,
updating. Sorry, go ahead.
just remember that it takes resources for the developers to bring these programs to fruition. So it truly is that they want 95% confidence that a project is going to get built before they start to subscribe users to it, because that takes a lot of time and energy.
Mhm. Yes.
Sorry, what were you going to say, Anthony?
I was going to mention that we recently had put out a request for comment, a draft of our some updated marketing guidelines, as well as a request for comments and updates to the disclosure form, which is one of the requirements in our program, and in particular in the community solar disclosure form. We got some very useful comments on revisions of that, and we're looking at those and reviewing those. So in coming weeks, we'll be making additional announcements about what the next steps will be to update those, and whether I think some of the requests we got we'll be able to accommodate, others we won't. But stay tuned for things we can do to try to improve the community solar subscription process.
And I don't know if you can say anything about this, or if you have any information about it, but Rex asks, do you know the average interconnection cost for community solar projects?
I don't know that number, and I also think there will ultimately be a difference between the estimates provided by the utility and the final interconnection cost. I think that's something that will have to be monitored over time.
Yeah, the interconnection costs have been a concern. I think more so in ComEd is the feedback I've gotten from developers. And so when you're developing a solar project, you have to apply for interconnection, whether it's DG or community solar or utility scale, with the utility, and then the utility will tell you, yes, you can do this, or yes, you can do this with X, Y, and Z upgrades. And so it's a process of back and forth. And of course, Illinois is a greenfield, so ComEd and Ameren are, responding as best they can, but it's not perfect. And there have been some comments that compared to costs on the East Coast, that the costs here have been a little high. So it hasn't prevented projects from getting across the finish line. So that's the good news. And it'll, time will tell.
Yeah, so one of the provisions we had in the program for community solar, I guess actually applied to DG projects as well, that if they got revised interconnection costs back from the utility that were very high, they had a path out of the contract. And we've had probably half a dozen projects drop out because of that. So while yes, the numbers have come in high in some cases, there's been a path forward, but it's not been a huge portion of the projects in the community solar subset of adjustable block. The vast majority of the projects have gotten interconnection costs back that the developers are choosing to proceed with those projects. And as I mentioned, there is a rulemaking going on at the Illinois Commerce Commission that might make revisions to the interconnection costs. Another thing that I think in terms of thinking about, how do you develop community solar, one of the things ComEd eventually published was, system hosting maps showing where, where on their system might be better places for community solar to be placed versus others in terms of load on feeders and how community solar projects being added to those feeders might impact things. Those came out after a lot of developers were already lining up projects. Hindsight is easy. In retrospect, maybe a process where those sorts of maps and more information was available to developers about places where interconnection costs would be low could have been useful. Developers instead were making their educated guesses at those locations. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. In terms of thinking of the future of community solar, the direction of adjustable block program was a very market-based, developer-driven model for finding projects. But it is something to think about going forward, that maybe think if we're not going to have community solar projects located, in the community right next to their subscriber, maybe there are other ways of thinking about how to optimize their locations that would be a very different process than what we have today. I don't have a great suggestion for what that would look like. Those are the sort of things I think probably need to come into play as we think about the future of community solar.
Yeah, today community solar projects can be located anywhere in the IOU. So for ComEd ratepayers or subscribers, the community solar project just has to be in ComEd territory, and likewise for Ameren and Mid-American. So it's very, very flexible, but it can turn out that then the community solar project that you're subscribed to is hundreds of miles away, because Illinois is a big state. So
and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if a developer can find the most efficient, lowest cost way of developing the project, and then turns that into a more attractive subscription offer to the subscriber that saves them more money, that's a good thing. But again, you may have other subscribers for whom something like proximity to the project, they feel a local connection may be important. You may find others who, there's been interest around the Midwest and elsewhere around pollinator-friendly habitats for solar sites. That may be something that someone wants to subscribe to a project that has, pollinator-friendly habitat around it. Other subscribers may not care about that. So I think these are these open issues in community solar that still, I think, remain to be determined.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned pollinator friendly. We do have the Illinois scorecard for pollinator friendly solar, which is a great resource. If you just Google that, you'll find the checklist. It's an online checklist developed by Adam Dolezal, who's an entomologist at the University of Illinois. And I myself have hosted several meetings and workshops on this topic. So if you want to know more about pollinator friendly solar, reach out to me directly. Anything else, I guess, you want to say about the adjustable block program? I do want to spend some time on the other two parts of the program, but can you say anything about how the program is evolving?
Sure. So with our revised long-term plan that I mentioned before, we are making some tweaks in the program. As I mentioned, some changes to marketing guidelines, disclosure forms coming soon. We've started the process of updating the contract between the approved vendors and the utilities. We issued a request for comments, got some comments back about a week ago. We're now working through what will be the next steps on that. The goal is to have a simplified contract that will be with a little bit more flexibility in certain places. So we'll be announcing next steps on that as well. Designation of, try that again. Designee registration is something else that will be implemented soon that will allow us to better track the participants in the program. We're simplifying some of the application requirements. Those are being phased in. Some of the ways in which developers or approved vendors submit batches of projects are being simplified as well. So there's a number of tweaks around the program to make it more efficient that we're phasing in. Hopefully will make the program work better. But the approved plan, there's no massive overhaul of the adjustable block program. I think as I tried to get at, for the most part, the program has been working pretty well.
Ryan comments that the new plan introduced scoring for community solar, which includes density and adjacent township points. Mm-hmm. I think you were referring to this, but is that completely resolved, that scoring system, so to speak?
The Illinois Commerce Commission sort of adopted the basic framework we proposed in our plan for that. Prior to opening up additional blocks of community solar capacity, we will hold stakeholder processes, workshops, et cetera, to sort of refine the details of all of that. So the framework is there, the details have to still be added in. But at this point, absent legislative change to free up funding, we won't be opening additional blocks of capacity in the near future.
Right. So
and when we do, there will be a lengthy process to get stakeholder input to flesh out that process, give developers adequate lead time to put together projects, apply for interconnection, et cetera. So for community solar, there will be there's a fairly long lead time once we have the ability to move forward. But what we just don't have right now is that ability to move forward.
So what you're touching on is the greatest challenge perhaps of the ABP right now, is that we're coming to the closing of blocks 1 through 4. Those have already closed for community solar and commercial solar for all intents and purposes. And then residential will close sometime in the next 6-12 months. What's next is block 5, et cetera. And what we don't know is when block 5 will open. That is anybody's guess. Is that right? Or what do you tell constituents about when to expect the opening of block 5?
Absent legislative change, looking at the funding formulas, there really is not additional funding for the adjustable block program or for additional utility scale procurement, which the Commission has also asked, instructed us to prioritize before probably 2024. These numbers are all in flux because of not knowing the extent to which COVID-19 will cause the delays in energization of projects, because energization of projects then correlates with when the payments for RECs start getting made to developers. So there's a lot of there's a lot of moving pieces in that. But again, absent any changes, there is a funding constraint for a few years, and in fact, some of the funds that were collected from ratepayers to support renewables would be refunded back to customers if they're not spent. And we update our long-term plan every 2 years. So again, one was just approved now, and our next plan presumably will be approved in spring of 2022. That would guide the agency activities for 22-23, and you roll that forward every 2 years. So absent legislative change, there's a cycle that will go forward that at some point when the funds are available, we would be able to reopen the program.
So for any of our listeners who don't understand exactly what's going on here, all ratepayers in Illinois are paying a fee on their power bill, commercial, residential. That is collected by the utilities, and then that money is paid out to contract or system owners for DG. And the money is being paid out faster than it's being collected. We have a great 15-year REC being paid out over 5 years. So it's a 3 times accelerated payout. And what that does is it greatly enhances the payback period. So we now have a 4 to 6 year payback period for DG in Illinois, which is outstanding on a national basis. We are truly a top 5 solar market. The downside is there is now a funding cliff. There is additional legislation that's being considered in Springfield. Whether that will be truly considered in this session or be kicked down the road until the fall session is TBD. So pay attention to the news, and we don't have a crystal ball. Obviously, the state of Illinois, like all the states in the United States now, are wrestling with COVID-19 and all of the additional spending related to that, and recovering from that. So that is a major distraction. The upside is that clean energy investment is a great way to create jobs, clean the air, and produce economic growth. So we're hopeful, and check out the Illinois Solar Energy Association, the Path to 100, and then there is another piece of legislation called the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So we have our work cut out for us. At the end of the day, one of the goals is more REC money. So let's talk a little bit big picture. The goal of the RPS in Illinois is 25% clean power by 2025. The goal of FEJA was to fulfill that goal. The RPS was quote unquote broken prior to FEJA. Now we have some good activity, a lot of solar being added to the state, but is that adequate to achieve the RPS?
Well, it just occurred to me, people often, when FEJA was being considered, kept on talking about how the RPS was broken and that FEJA was going to fix it. In retrospect, I think maybe the better way to describe it is that FEJA was a repair to it. A repair doesn't solve everything, but at least it improves things. Pre-FEJA, we were very limited in what we could do to incent the development of new renewables in the state. FEJA has helped, but it doesn't get us all the way there. The other thing to keep in mind is that FEJA only looks at a slice of the world, in the sense that it's focused on the consumption of electricity in Illinois and what portion of that is being met through renewable energy credits. So just to step back a little bit, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that a lot of the renewable energy projects in Illinois are not participants in our state's RPS. They're either selling their RECs to corporate buyers, they're selling them to renewable energy programs in other states, or, when I looked in 2018 to 2019, nearly 7 million wind RECs generated in Illinois were not retired. And retired is what someone does basically to use the RECs for the environmental compliance. So there is a lot of renewable energy in the state that is not part of everything we're talking about. I think that sometimes gets a little lost in these conversations, and this is mostly on the wind side, that there's a whole world of renewable development that's larger than us. But we also are not on track to meet some of the percentage-based goals that were in FEJA. In theory, by 2025, we're supposed to be having 30 million RECs being procured by the various utility scale procurements we've done, prior procurements done by the IPA, the adjustable block program, and absent changes will be well short of that. So, I think the good news is, you mentioned a few bills, there's several others that were under consideration. A lot of ideas were floating around, and I think conversations were starting this spring about what the future energy, clean energy mix of the state would look like and how to get there. There's some significant disagreements in terms of how to get there and what the structure of that would look like. But the fact that there were all these legislative proposals pushing us those directions, I think, was a positive sign for the state. Obviously, we're not on the pace of hashing that out that I think we hoped we would be. But the fact that the conversations about how to move that direction, rather than, some states have seen attempts to roll back standards and things like that, I think conceptually we're heading the right direction. It's just getting there is proving to be a lot more difficult than maybe people hoped it would be.
So if you want a sustainable renewables program in Illinois, the lesson is get engaged, talk to your legislators, become informed about how the program can be augmented. How can we get basically a FEJA Part 2? We need more RECs to have a smooth growth to that 25%, barring major legislation. Do you have a best guess as to what we will reach with FEJA? Is it 17? Is it 15%?
Right now, absent anything new, we're going to be getting to about 10 million RECs. So, so it's roughly a third of where we should be by 2025. Mm-hmm. Again, I think that will change because we'll have new procurement long-term plans in 2022 and 2024. Those, as some of these initial adjustable block program contracts are paid out, funding will become available. So we'll be able to add something to what we're doing. But again, to get to the higher levels, we need a more fundamental change, and that only is to get to 25%. Obviously, by 2040, 2050, we want the state to be far beyond 25% clean energy. Additional ways of thinking about things and how to get there will be needed that go beyond what we're doing today. At some point, the model we've adopted in Illinois has been one of renewable energy credits, keep renewable energy decoupled from the energy markets. That creates challenges for the developers of utility scale projects looking for off-takers for the energy, because often they may want the RECs as well. So long term, I think we need to probably step back and think about how does renewable energy development mesh in with the fact that Illinois is a state with retail choice where 80-something% of the load is served by alternative suppliers. They have their own dynamics about how they choose to procure the energy they buy for their customers. The IPA does the procurement for the residential small commercial customers that don't switch to alternative suppliers. That again is only a small piece of the market. Long term, I think we need to think about how all these pieces fit together, and the the model of using REC as the incentive for renewable energy development may need to be expanded at some point to really get to those high penetration goals. It works okay at the levels we're at today, but imagining a future where the state's entirely served by clean energy probably will take a bigger adjustment to the market.
Yeah, I mean, we do see in neighboring states like Indiana, where the utility has announced that they are, this is NIPSCO in northern Indiana, has announced that they're going to install 1,200 megawatts of solar in their market and retire coal and gas facilities. So there are other forces certainly at play here.
Like
So
you're a vertically integrated state that does an integrated resource planning process. That's a very different market structure than Illinois. And I think
yes,
that's one of our challenges is that, what's happening in Indiana is really impressive, but you can't just take their approach and drop it onto Illinois with the successes we've had with the restructuring of our electricity industry.
good point. Let's talk about Solar for All, Anthony. How do you see that program coming along? Obviously, we've had a couple of discussions here on SolarWorks for Illinois with John Carson and the program director or the program administrator, and I hear basically good things, but it's a complicated program. What are your thoughts about Solar for All?
But Solar for All, I think, has had its successes and challenges. Within Solar for All, there really are sort of three aspects of it. There's a low-income community solar aspect, there's incentives for nonprofits and public facilities, and then there's what's called the distributed generation subprogram, which really means, in Solar for All terms, residential projects. On community solar, it's been somewhat similar to the adjustable block program, with more projects applying than there was funding available. Projects have been selected, they're under development. But stepping back again to the big picture of community solar, if you look around the country and how low-income community solar has been approached, in some places the idea has been dedicated low-income community solar projects. In other cases, it's been community solar projects having a requirement that some portion of their subscribers are low income, and sort of mixing things together. Here in Illinois, the Illinois Solar for All approach, that was contained in FEJA, really has us having dedicated low income community solar projects. I think that's something to keep an eye on. I honestly don't know which model is better, the dedicated project or the hybrid model, but it's something that I think is worth keeping an eye on nationally as we think about the future of that program. The nonprofit public facilities subprogram within Solar for All, I think, has gone well. The program year opened up in the fall. It reached capacity earlier this year. For this program year, we'll be opening up the next program year for applications over this summer. So I think things look pretty good there in terms of projects coming in, demonstrating their value to the nonprofits or public facilities that are participating. The part of Solar for All that has been slower is the DG program for residential customers. At this point, we only have one large multifamily project, and I believe not 8 or 9 single-family homes that are participating in that program. So this is very small compared to the thousands and thousands of homes that are participating in the adjustable block program. We have some number of vendors who are indicating that they are planning to serve that sector. So we'll see what happens. We coming out of our our long-term renewable resources procurement plan revisions, we're making some changes to Solar for All to sort of try to simplify things like the income verification part of the program. Hopefully that will reduce some of the transaction costs for approved vendors. So that part has gone slowly. I think I was beginning to see some positive signs there, but again, COVID-19 obviously throws everything out the window in terms of the ability to market to customers gets a lot more difficult. So we've seen a slowdown there. We'll start to see what happens. And we'll continue to monitor that, and we'll propose additional program adjustments if we really aren't turning the corner on that.
On the community solar side, this is within Solar for All. I heard that the contract for subscribers is quite lengthy. Is that something that's under consideration to make that more streamlined?
Well, there's not a Solar for All contract for subscribers. There's a disclosure form for subscribers, the same as there is in the adjustable block program. And that's something that we're continuing to look at.
Okay. Anything else about solar? Can you say how many megawatts of solar are getting developed so far in Solar for All?
I don't have that number on the top of my head, unfortunately. None of the projects, I think the first few projects have been coming online, so we should have some updated data. But there is information of all the projects that have been selected to date on the Solar for All website, which is illinoissfa.com. And if you look at the reports there, you can see all the projects that are under development as part of that program.
And does that include brownfield? Is Solar for All the main program for brownfield solar in Illinois, or are there multiple programs?
Solar for All, no, we had a separate competitive brownfield procurement that we conducted in 2019. And I believe 2 projects are under development under that. And the commission's order approving our revised long-term plan does indicate that should funding become available, that we should run another brownfield photovoltaic procurement as part of the list of priorities of additional procurement activity that would take place.
Yeah, I mean, brownfields are great for solar because there's little else many times you can do with those parcels. Some of these are closed landfills. Some of them are contaminated industrial sites. And so putting a ballasted ground mount solar array on these sites is a wonderful repurposing of them. And we have a project here in Champaign County where I'm based that is going to be on a closed landfill for the city of Urbana. I think that's a 4 megawatt project, all said. So that's a wonderful asset once it comes online. And my understanding is that's in the low income category somehow.
Right. I believe so there's 2 ways of thinking about brownfields. We had a specific procurement for projects located on brownfields, but we have also seen some other projects that have applied to be in the community solar field that happen to be on brownfield sites, but are not being treated from the sort of regulatory perspective as brownfield site projects. So yeah, there are 2 low-income community solar projects under development that are located on landfill, but for our purposes, we're not considering those brownfield site projects.
Sure. Understood. I also have a utility scale project in my backyard, just 10 miles away from where I live in the town of Sydney. That's a 150 megawatt project that BayWa is developing. So let's talk about utility scale solar. Those, you've had several procurements, several large, 99 plus megawatt projects have won awards. How do you see that program coming along?
I sometimes have to stop and take a deep breath and think about the idea of these 100, 200 megawatt solar projects. Because again, prior to FEJA, there was less than 100 megawatts of solar in the entire state. So the thought that there are individual projects out there that are that size or larger is still something that takes my breath away when I find time to stop and think about it. One issue we've certainly seen on the utility scale solar side is that the MISO interconnection process is also taking a lot longer and being a lot more complicated than some developers had anticipated. That led to some legislation to allow the extension of deadlines for energization for a certain category of projects. So I think that has definitely been a challenge for the utility scale solar industry, is the delays at MISO. But again, we've seen some announcements come out about offtakers for the energy for some of those projects. I think that's an encouraging sign. My impression is, a lot of these projects are under development. Certainly, they're being impacted by COVID-19 like everyone else. So, when those start coming online, I think we're not quite sure yet, but we're optimistic, because that's, if you think about the quantities, the huge amounts of megawatts of solar that can be added in Illinois are coming from the utility scale projects. We spend a lot of time paying attention to the projects in the adjustable block program, as we should, because there are a lot of them. They are scattered throughout communities all across the state. They have tangible impacts, positive impacts on homes and businesses. It's an important part of the solar industry. But when you step back and look at the megawatts and what's going to be, how they, bigger impact on the climate, the utility scale projects are significantly larger in scale.
Indeed. So just to give people a sense of scale, for community solar, these are 2 megawatt AC or 2.5 megawatt DC projects. Those are typically 15 or 20 acre projects. 150 megawatt project that's happening here in Champaign County is 1,200 acres of solar, 1,600 acres all said behind the fence. So very different. The thing to keep in mind is, when we are truly striving for a 100% renewable powered grid, it takes a lot of solar. I've seen figures of, I think, 2,000 gigawatts of solar for, as part of the mix. Of course, it's going to be solar, storage, and wind, and other sources, hydro, pumped storage, et cetera. But we truly need, basically in a state like Illinois, a gigawatt of solar per county. We have about 100 counties in Illinois. And so I think that there is a need for some utility scale solar. It is so cost effective, and we have very cheap power here in the Midwest, which is one of the reasons why solar has been slow to come to the Midwest. Ratepayers in Illinois might pay a third of what ratepayers pay in California or in New York or Massachusetts or New Jersey. And that is an impediment to the growth of renewables in the Midwest, where we have cheap power and lots of legacy fossil plants and nuclear. We have a very large nuclear fleet in Illinois. We haven't talked about ZECs, but do you have any comments or concerns about the ZEC program?
The ZEC program was part of FEJA as well. It was a separate plan and procurement developed and conducted by the Illinois Power Agency to support at-risk nuclear plants. And we developed that, and I believe the procurement took place in beginning of 2018. And now 2 of the nuclear facilities in Illinois, the Clinton and Quad Cities plants, there's 2 reactors at the Quad Cities, so 3 reactors total, are receiving ZEC payments. The program also had, there's some court challenges to it that are now resolved. So in terms of supporting those plants as a mechanism to prevent premature closure, it has worked. Now there's open issues about other nuclear plants in Illinois and their economics. I'll leave those to another day. But in terms of one of those options that was out there that came out of FEJA that we've implemented, the implementation of what we were asked to do under FEJA went as planned.
Can you say that again, that last piece?
In terms of what FEJA asked us to do in terms of zero emissions credits or ZEC, we successfully implemented that, and it all went according to plan.
Okay. And basically the amount of funding for ZECs was equivalent to the amount of funding for renewable energy credits, right?
Yeah, basically it's about the same amount per year.
Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on, how to truly integrate an RPS into a state like Illinois? Because obviously we're struggling a little bit with that.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to mention that you touched on briefly just now is storage. I think it's interesting to me that Illinois really does not have any storage is not really factored into our current RPS. Yet there's quite a few large storage projects that have been developed in Illinois, mostly to take part in the PJM frequency regulation markets. So storage, I think, is one of the policy gaps that we have in order to get up to those very high percentages of renewables on the system. We're going to need a lot more storage. Others, and other states are looking at this. I think we still have plenty of time, but I think that's going to be an important aspect, is to make sure we have good storage policies if we need those to incent additional development. We're seeing some, I'm getting the impression some solar is being sold now with storage as part of it, but it's not a huge part of the market yet.
Yeah, we are installing several megawatts of storage on an annual basis now. but it is still small compared to the amount of
Yeah.
solar. And some states are now formalizing storage incentives, Massachusetts, New York, California. So it's coming, and I
And
wholeheartedly agree.
ideally, yeah, ideally, if storage can be installed without the requirement for a state program to create incentives for it, all the better. But I think to get to the sort of larger amounts of storage that we'll need to make, keep the grid operating reliably, I suspect we will need more concrete state policy to support solar.
Agreed. So one thing we
Right,
haven't,
storage, to support storage as well as solar.
yep, one thing we haven't talked about, and then we're going to wrap up here, is in FEJA there is a threshold set that when the grid reaches a certain percent of renewables on the grid, then net metering gets reevaluated. And Ameren has now filed that they have reached the 3% limit. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you see that playing out?
Sure, I can answer parts of that. So yes, there is a provision in FEJA where when a certain percentage of net metering of load is net metered, the way in which the smart inverter rebate is valued at changes, and then also it will be phased in for residential customers, and full retail net metering will be phased out. Ameren has indicated they've reached that level, and they've initiated proceeding with the Illinois Commerce Commission to start this process. There are currently 2 motions to dismiss pending in that case, 2 groups that argue that Ameren has not in fact met that threshold to trigger all of this. That again, it's a regulatory proceeding. It has a certain process associated with that still has to play out, and so I can't really opine on that at this time.
Yeah, this is
the issue. I think one of the challenges is whether this happens now or at a later date, is that the transition for residential customers from the net metering as it's currently available to something new will be a change, and I think making sure we accommodate that transition will be important. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, we will look at REC prices. If it makes sense to make adjustments to REC prices, we will do that. One of the challenges is that we're moving to a sort of place-based approach to thinking about the value of solar. And that could create some really interesting challenges, in that you could have people living across the street from each other who, because of the feeder they're served by, the smart inverter rebate that they would get would be quite different. So that's something I think we're going to have to think about, how to have customers understand why one of these pieces of the value proposition for them for solar could be very different for legitimate technical engineering reasons, but things that may not be as clear to a homeowner why the person across the street is getting something larger than that. There'll be good reasons for it, but I think it'll be something that as an industry, you'll have to think about how to articulate and explain that to customers.
This is an unfolding saga, and so you just have to stay tuned. It truly is a case where FEJA was not clear on this matter, on how exactly to do the math. And so now you have 2 opposing sides, the IOUs and the industry, for all intents and purposes, saying this is how you should do the math. And so it will probably be decided in the courts. And hopefully before
that, there's a procedure the Illinois Commerce Commission is designed to address issues exactly like this. So I think this will play out before the Illinois Commerce Commission first. Whether people then take that to the courts, I think it's very premature to say anything about that.
Okay. Good enough.
I have confidence in regulatory processes, but that's just me.
Anthony, is there anything else that you wanted to address today?
No, this has been really, really great. I don't know if I know we're probably a little over if there were additional questions. I have not been watching the chat or questions. I guess one thing I would want to emphasize is I understand it, because of COVID-19, this has been a difficult time for the industry. We've had to make changes. We're doing everything we can to make sure the program continues to operate, and we're processing applications. We did impose some restrictions on marketing. Those restrictions don't include ongoing installation work as long as you have the consent of the project host. We're going to be issuing some additional clarification on that shortly. So we appreciate the challenges people are facing, and we're doing everything we can to keep the program being successful.
Great. Well, I want to make a few announcements for anybody who missed the introduction. We have two great upcoming events. In June, we have Brian Haug, president of the Illinois Solar Energy Association and president of Continental Energy Solutions. We're going to talk about how the Illinois solar market has evolved 2017 to present. And then in July, we have a dear colleague of ours, Steve Johnson and John Kivlin at Convergence Energy, who will come on the show to discuss their experience developing solar and battery storage in the Midwest. And with that, I want to thank our guest, Anthony Starr, Director of the Illinois Power Agency, for coming on the show. We really appreciate your time, Anthony, and have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening.